Hey everyone, I'm Hurricane Hal, host of the GeoTrek podcast, where we explore the world to bring you stories about extreme weather and natural disasters not covered by the mainstream media. Come along on the adventure. Like, subscribe, and follow our content online, on social media, your favorite podcast platform, and of course, our growing YouTube page. Well, without further introduction, let's jump into this GeoTrek podcast with Professor Dr. Joe Muller. Joe, thanks so much for taking time to come on the GeoTrek podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Joe, we're going to talk a lot about your exciting work in a field called paleotempestology. Before we get into that, though, could you explain for us your path into the sciences? Like, when did you become interested in weather and climate sciences, oceanography, coastal processes, all this stuff you do? How did you get interested in it?
Well, I grew up in Australia, as we were just discussing, and far northeast Queensland, Australia. And my dad he's a builder, a carpenter, a very talented carpenter actually, but he is really into being outside. And I grew up somewhat poor, I think. I didn't know it at the time, but we did a lot of camping, so all of our holidays were camping in the Australian bush. Four-wheel driving, and I just sort of love being outside, love the great outdoors, and I remember from a very young age, we would look at tropical cyclones. So when it got to cyclone season, so we just call them cyclones in Australia, and in the newspaper back in the day, they'd have the tracking map, and we would cut out the track map, and we would track, he would tell me to track the latitude and longitude. So I remember being a very small child learning about latitude and longitude and about tropical cyclone. And this was, back in the day when we didn't have spaghetti models and all that sort of thing. And sometimes we'd lose power and we would listen to the radio, and I would stay up late at night with my dad, and I would also watch him running around the backyard, like picking up logs of wood. He's a builder, so he had all this generally missiles in the backyard, ready to go, and he would only pick it up 24 hours before landfall. So that's kind of how I grew up. I grew up with tropical cyclone, and I just thought that was normal. And now I realize, especially as a professor now, and spending a lot of time with students, that's not necessarily normal, the way that I grew up, which I'm really grateful that I had that experience. But yeah, I definitely do what I do. I'm a scientist because of my old man.
Joe, I have to ask you, our listeners in the States are going to often have this perception, if you go outdoors in Australia, there's 10 to 15 things that are all trying to kill you. I mean, did you ever feel under a threat out there in the bush, or is this just kind of an American perception that isn't really true?
No, I think it's probably true. It definitely is. I look now at when I go home and I talk to my parents, I can barely understand them. My dad is like Crocodile Dundee, but probably more irresponsible. But when we were kids, I tell this story, Phil loves this story, but when we were kids, we would get to a camping site, and my dad would throw our dog in the water, and I used to cry because I thought it meant, I'm like, why does Chloe get to swim first? I would be crying, I've been in the car for hours, I want to go for a swim, and he's like, oh, she's a good dog, she deserves to swim around. But find out years later, he was checking for crocodiles, and Chloe was
she was like the tester, right? Let's see if there are any crocs in here. We're not going to send our kid, we're going to send the dog, right?
And she would always sleep outside the tent, and she was kind of my dog. I'm a big dog person, so I'm like, can Chloe come sleep in the tent tonight? He's like, she likes the fresh air. We'll have her out front. And so she was there, for the crocs and the snakes. But yeah, I grew up with all that, and I remember being a grad student and trekking through the bush, on geology field camps, and massive bird spiders, and pulling myself up onto ledges, and there being brown snakes, really deadly snakes. So people laugh at me now when we're out in the field and I when I see like an alligator or I see a snake, I'm always thinking it's poisonous. And I actually had a snake in my house recently, and so it does freak me out. But I'm used to those things killing you. So
Yeah,
usually,
it seems like a lot of very poisonous reptiles and different critters out there. I could understand your complete reaction. So bringing you to today, you said you're a professor and you live in the state of Florida, right? In the
I
U.S.?
do. Yeah, I live in Fort Myers, Florida, and I'm at Florida Gulf Coast University, which is kind of sandwiched between Fort Myers and Naples.
So before we get into your professional work, one last question. So you grew up kind of in the tropical part of coastal Australia. Now you're in a very tropical place on the coastline of the U.S. in Florida. I mean, how do those coastal environments maybe seem similar and seem different?
It's such a great question. And I actually I did the first place I lived in the US was Woods Hole. So I was at the Woods Hole Oceanographic. And I just remember calling my sister and she was living in Sweden. So we were like really out of our comfort zone. I'm like,
Yeah, she was in Sweden. You were in coastal Massachusetts there in New England. That's a very different climate than northern Queensland, right?
Yes. And I'm like, I'm so cold. What do I do? And she's like, you need to buy wool. Like, just go out and buy wool. It'll help you.
So Florida probably seems a lot more familiar to you.
Yes. I never really had to dress. I'd not seen snow until I was 19. So, but then I was at Woods Hole and I was applying for jobs, and I remember interviewing in Florida. I was interviewing kind of all over the place, and they flew me down, and it was March, and it was lovely down here, and I was like, I think I need to move back to the South.
Oh, they did the right thing by flying you from New England to Florida in March. You couldn't find a better month for contrast, right? You were like, do I even have to go back to Woods Hole, right?
Yeah, that's typically the interview season. But I was interviewing in New Jersey as well, and like Colorado, a few different places. But yeah, it is very similar in many ways, and then kind of different in others. Where I'm from in tropical Northeast Australia, if you ever get a chance to go there, it's gorgeous, very rugged. Bit more, just a very dry in my hometown. There are mangroves, like there are here. And then it's kind of special, actually, a little north of that. It's like kind of where the rainforest meets the ocean. So those are beautiful landscapes that we don't necessarily have here in Florida. But here we have cypress domes and these wetlands that we don't really have back in Australia. And it actually makes for very different paleotempestology. So you can't do in Australia what we do here. But there's other things that you can do there. So we have barrier islands there as well, and more beach ridge deposits and things like that we use to look at tropical cyclones. So yeah, very similar climate, and somewhat similar coastal environments, but a little bit different.
Joe, you mentioned the word paleotempestology, and that really gets us into talking about your professional work. Could you explain the science behind paleotempestology, and like how do scientists do this, and why is it so important?
Yeah, so it's obviously a weird word for most people. They've not heard of it before. But tempest meaning storm, and paleo meaning generally like prehistoric. And so it's kind of like this extension, a way to extend the historical hurricane record that we have. So I only do paleotempestology in the Atlantic Basin. I would love to at some point work in Australia, but maybe not for quite a while. So here in the Atlantic Basin, our historical record, which is the Herdat record, goes back about 160 years or so. And it's relatively short, but it's quite long actually when you compare to other records like the typhoon records. It's incredible really that we have the data. But it just means that for very rare storms like our major hurricanes, there's not a lot of information. So there are particular parts of the coastline, especially the United States continental coastline, where we're really kind of unsure. There's a lot of uncertainty on what the landfalling numbers are like, and what to expect, what the models should do. And so this is one way to actually extend this historical record back through time, and we can do this in several different ways, but we're essentially using the geologic record to look at hurricane events that have made landfall in the past, and we can go back thousands of years. The longest paleotempestology record was just kind of published from a Mexican blue hole, and I can talk a little bit more about blue holes today if you'd like, but they have the longest records, and that one there, it's kind of debatable, but it goes back at least 5,000 to 6,000 years, and it's very impressive. But Jeff Donnelly, who is a colleague of mine at Woods Hole, he has quite a few records that extend back to 3,000 years. He's got a Puerto Rican record, a couple from the Bahamas, Jamaica. There's some really impressive paleotempestology records that go back thousands of years.
Joe, when you mentioned building out a geologic record, are you and your colleagues often drilling or digging sediment cores? Is that generally how you approach it? Are there other ways? I mean, how do you find this geologic record?
Yeah, so that's what I do. I do a lot of coring. I love coring. I think this goes back to just being out in the bush with my dad. But there are other ways. There are folks that have looked at tree rings, speleothems. There are historical records. So there are a couple of really cool shipwreck records for looking at historical hurricane. And so there are a few other ways, but generally sediment cores are the more established paleotempestology methodology, which is honestly pretty young. This is work that kind of was started in the 80s and 90s, but very, very few people doing this research. It's mostly spearheaded by Camby Liu, who is out of Louisiana State University. And yeah, so it's a fairly new type of science. There are more paleotempestologists nowadays than there was when I was kind of in my 20s, but still it's a fairly small field. We generally know each other, most of us, yeah.
Joe, when you get a sediment core, how easy is it to see? I'm imagining you're looking for a small layer, maybe an overwash layer. I mean, what are you looking for? Like a change in color, maybe a change in the grain size of sediments? I mean, what are you looking for, and how easy is it to find it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's actually a pretty simple science in terms of the geology. We are looking for layers that are sometimes different color, but generally a grain size difference. It depends where you core. What's really important is establishing the background sediment, so the environment that you're coring in. And there's a couple of different environments that I core in. First is like a back barrier environment. So you might want to think about the sorts of environments in Florida behind the dune, like maybe where you would kayak, like where you'll see a lot of mangroves. They're a bit smelly because they're very organic rich, and they're the ones I love to core in. If I jump out of the boat to core and I sink in the sediment, I know it's where I want to core. I remember a grad student once, we jumped into a lagoon and he was sinking so much, he was grabbing onto the mangrove trees, and he said, "I don't want to die in here." I was like...
That's ideal, right? Because you have so much organic matter, right? I mean, that's like, and for you, you're like, okay, you're not going to die, you're going to be fine.
We're definitely coring here. So they're the sorts of environments I like to core in the back barrier, because the background sediment's really fine grained, very organic rich. It's what we refer to as a low energy environment. And that's why people kayak back there. But when you have a hurricane, especially one, as you know, you're very familiar with these storms, ones that have a lot of water column energy, a lot of storm surge, the environment completely changes for a short period of time generally. And let's say you have, a 10-foot or 15-foot storm surge, which we see in the Gulf of America quite regularly, regularly for us, right? Where you'll see this process, you refer to it as overwash, where you have a very dynamic water column, a storm surge. It has a lot of sediment in it.
Sure.
You can actually see it on the satellite imagery. The water will look really dirty, and that's because there's a lot of sediment grains in the water column, and they're all different grain sizes, so you'll get fine stuff, but also medium, and what we refer to as coarse grain sediments. That all gets transported back into the lagoon that generally is a low energy environment and is only depositing fine grain sands. So you'll see kind of like these layers, these hurricane layers, if you're lucky. And when we core, I like to core with a poly tube, a clear tube, just to core the top to look and see what's there. We've had quite a few storms in this area in the recent history, so you can kind of get a sense for whether it's going to be a good core if you can see a couple of recent hurricanes in the top. And then if we want to go deeper, we core with aluminium piping. And we have a bunch of different coring methodologies that we use depending on whether we're going to do it from the boat or from the water. And then we can go for much longer cores where you can kind of get these longer records that extend back beyond the historical record into the paleo record. Yeah.
Joe, do you generally have an idea of a storm that you're looking for? Like, okay, maybe there's anecdotal talk about a storm that was maybe 250 years ago. Or sometimes are you doing a deeper core and you're finding something by complete surprise? Like no one's even talked about a big event in this area maybe 500 years ago, but you see something in the core.
Absolutely. Recently I started coring on the Southwest Florida plateau with Jeff Donnelly. So Jeff Donnelly, he's a research scientist up at Woods Hole. He'd be fun to talk to. But he is really the first person to core what we refer to as blue holes. And so they're like sinkholes, but they turn into blue holes when sea level rises and floods the platform. So in the last 6,000 years, our platform has been completely flooded. It was exposed during, the last glacial maximum, and so you had these sinkholes form, and they're just big holes in the carbonate platform, but they make for really great archives for hurricanes, and they're great because they're super low. They're out in the ocean, for starters. They're not too far offshore, so we can easily access them by boat, but they're really low energy in the hole because the holes are really deep, and they tend to be anoxic, so you don't get a lot of, we refer to it as biotubation, where you get little organisms burrowing up and down through the record and messing up your hurricane record. But they're also really high resolution, so you get a lot of, our blue holes here have got almost a centimeter every year. So you almost have annual resolution, and I was just up at Woods Hole recently because when we go for these long cores, like I mentioned, we're using aluminium piping because it has to be hardy. So we took a 15 and a half meter core from Amberjack Blue Hole, which is up near Sarasota. And it was the longest core we could take on that ship. When we pulled it on, it was extended all the way in past the moon pole, almost into the galley. And it took everyone on deck, all the crew, all the students, trying to pull that guy onto the ship. But we couldn't see it. We couldn't visually see it because it was in an aluminum pipe. And then I was at Woods Hole. I hadn't seen them yet in person. We run the analysis, and you can see where the high grain size peaks are, where the hurricanes are, but it's one thing to see it visually, the entire thing, and in the bottom of that record, in the last 2 meters, it's very, very active. Lots of hurricane layers, and some really thick hurricane layers with big, like almost like boulder size pieces of carbonate, which are probably from the blue hole itself or like the edges of the blue hole, but really high energy sort of storm deposition.
Joe, I want to actually, for you to clarify, this is fantastic. You've mentioned several times that you like to work in low energy environments, but then it sounds like sometimes you're finding pieces of rock or larger sediment grain sizes. Is that indicative that, wow, normally this area is low energy, but on a certain date back far in time, something was very different and it was high energy for that moment, and this is captured by the core? Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. And it's at the moment we're deploying buoys offshore here, so we're trying to figure out how to moor them to the seabed, and hopefully they stay during a hurricane. But I've been looking a lot more at what happens to the water column during an event, and we did have a couple of, they're called tilt meters. And they're suspended to the seabed. We had a couple out at our coral sites for our Department of Marine and Ecological Sciences, and they bottomed out, so they were completely tipped over, and they maxed out during Ian. So we had two of them that maxed out at 70 centimeters per second. That's the highest that they can register. So the water at the sea floor is moving during Ian. Was moving at greater than 70 centimeters per second in deep water too. Like one of them is at 25 meters and one is at 10. So one's kind of further out on the platform, one's in shallower water. So you'd expect the velocity to be more in the shallow water. But that was like, I knew this. I know like during tropical cyclone transition, through an area, you're going to see very, very strong currents. But when you actually see the data, you're like, wow.
The power, right? It's just unbelievable.
Yeah. So if you have any sort of, everything is going to be, in that sort of scenario, if you can imagine 70 centimeters a second, that's how fast and strong the current's going. You're pretty much picking up everything that's on the seabed and you're putting it in the water column, and then it's going to settle out. So generally, it's tricky. Like in my world, I try not to attribute the grain size to the strength of the storm, especially when we're in the back barrier setting, because you have a very dynamic, we refer to it as geomorphology. So the dunes constantly changing, the foreshore is changing. So you may have a time period where the dune is really high, and then when it's shallow, and that's going to affect the hurricane layer. But you don't really have that in the blue hole. It's a hole, so it's a little better in that context to then compare layers to layers. So if you're seeing massive boulders and really coarse grains, you can assume that you've probably got a pretty strong event close to your blue hole. That's depositing that.
Well, that makes sense. You're saying what kind of water flow do you have to move grains of this size, right? You could probably reverse engineer this and say this was a tremendously strong storm with maybe strong currents and a high storm surge.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the things that we're doing. I'm actually having one of my grad students right now look at velocities of just sort of also nor'easters and kind of frontal events. We always get this question could you have one of these layers be deposited during another weather event? And when we look at those types of events, they're just nothing in comparison to what you would get during a major tropical cyclone. The water column is literally heaving. And so it does make me nervous about putting instruments in the water, expensive instruments, what sort of mooring on a buoy would be able to take that sort of movement. But we're not going to know what these storms are doing unless we have some instruments out there. So.
Joe, I have a few more questions for you about paleoclimatology, but before we get to that, you mentioned Hurricane Ian. You live in the Fort Myers area. Were you there in 2022?
I was not. Fortuitously, I was at a hurricane conference. I was actually at Swiss Re's. They had a Oasis event. This is with the reinsurance industry, all the guys that put together the catastrophe models. That's a whole another conversation, and probably better for someone that uses cat models. But it was really weird because I was at this event and there were a bunch of hurricane scientists there, and everyone was obsessed, like just looking at this storm. I actually didn't, at one point I'm like, why are we running the conference? No one's listening to the
When there's a big event, like no one can even pay attention.
Everyone's just on their tablets, on their laptops, running their model. This is obviously going to be an expensive event, so all the reinsurers are looking at the storm. But it was weird for me because I'm like, I live there and all my friends are there. I had a dog at the time.
So you lived in Fort Myers at the time, but when the storm came, you were at this conference.
I was in Zurich. So
this is ground zero for your town where you're living, and you're overseas watching this happen.
Yeah, it was devastating. The storm was absolutely, devastating for our students. I have a lot of friends that lost homes, lost cars, How
did it feel for you? I mean, you have scientific interest, but now all of a sudden it becomes very personal, right? You have a lot of friends and colleagues that are deeply impacted by this.
Yeah, 100%. I'm sure you're used to this as well, right? You have friends and family that are texting you. I was sitting in this conference and I had some of my friends, some of my girlfriends text me and they were like, Joe, I'm embarrassed to say this, but I didn't evacuate. I'm in flood zone A. I'm here with the kids. What should I do? And I was like, okay, you need to go upstairs. Can you see if your neighbors are home? They were like, should I evacuate now? I'm looking at it. It's right there. I'm like, you should not evacuate now.
Too late. Yeah.
You need to hunker down, but go upstairs and make sure that your neighbors are there and you have access to height. And that one friend did end up she had the storm surge through her house. I think she had 8 feet. So they went upstairs to their neighbors. They were living in apartments. Yeah. So must have had so many messages. People asked me, what should I do?
Yeah.
What do you
People
think?
were on edge. It's amazing how localized that storm was, too. I was in Punta Gorda trying to document the surge, and actually Charlotte Harbor ran dry. You'll enjoy this story because you like these mushy environments with organic material. I went down to the edge of Charlotte Harbor in the eye, and I saw movement on the bottom of the bay, and I was like, what's going on? I walked out maybe, 100 yards, and there were all these fish stranded. The surge there had pushed out. Wow. And I thought of you because of what you said about coring in environments that are mushy. I started sinking super fast, and I realized I'm in the eye of a Cat 4 hurricane. This is not a good place to be. So I got almost thigh deep, and it was very, very black sediment, almost looked like tar. And I just remember thinking, I need to get out of here. And I was deep enough in, I had to put my phone away, use both hands to push myself out, and wash myself off. And then I got back to the parking garage where I was documenting it with about 10 minutes to spare. And the back end of that eye wall was so much stronger than the front. Then what was amazing was you just go 15 miles away where they did not get the offshore winds, where they got the onshore winds. It was completely devastated by storm surge, and just the power of that, as you know, was just tremendous. Fort Myers Beach and other areas just hit incredibly hard. I was just curious because it hit where you were living and working, and that must feel different to you.
Yeah, no, and then we had Milton and Helene. I had no damage during Ian, but I had damage from Milton. So I had to get my roof repaired. Obviously I bought on the other side of 75. I'm not in a flood zone. I have hurricane glass. So I'm very privileged in that, with that perspective. So I've been very, this is obviously the sort of work that we do. So I didn't want to have to worry about that piece of it. I want to be able to close my door. But I did have to tell my dog sitter to not take my dog out. She's like, I know hurricane. I've lived in Florida for 20 years. It's not a big deal. And I was like, actually, sure, like she doesn't really know what I do, but I'm like, please just don't take my
Yeah.
dog outside during
Well,
the
it's
storm.
amazing too. The west coast of Florida. So many people said, "Oh, we've been through hurricanes our whole life." They had
Exactly.
not seen a landfalling major hurricane coming from the Gulf side, right? They had seen a lot of these storms cross the peninsula with a
Yeah.
strong offshore wind. I think a lot of folks in Southwest Florida, even the ones that said we've been here 40, 50 years, were shocked by what
Shock.
happened with Ian. Joe, as we close up, a few quick questions I have for you, a little more about paleotempestology. If you had unlimited funding, you could go anywhere and do sediment cores. Where would you go? Like, where's that frontier that you would want to have more data from?
Oh, it's such a good question. Everywhere? No. So I think the Bahamas have incredible blue holes, and research has mostly been shut down in the Bahamas due to permitting. So I would want to go there. Jeff and I were wanting to go there, but because of permitting, we've transitioned away from that. And I think that there's a lot of coring to still be done throughout the Caribbean. But this is actually the Southwest Florida platform, the blue holes that we've started to core. No one's ever cored them before. And, this record offshore of Sarasota, Tampa, is really important, I think, because Tampa is an area of high uncertainty. So, they just haven't had any major hurricanes make landfall there properly in the instrumental records. So, the question they have is this normal? Is this something to do with steering or something to do with the cyclogenesis, or is this actually just Tampa being lucky? So I think those sorts of records are really important. But yeah, I think the Caribbean. I actually was coring in around Micronesia. We're doing typhoon reconstructions. I think there's a lot of value in that as well. Obviously, massive exposure. Lots of people live in the North Pacific, and having a better sense of typhoon is really key as well. But yeah, I core anywhere, Hal.
Joe, what advice do you have for students, young professionals who say, okay, this is amazing. I want to do this when I get older, when I develop professionally. How can they get started? What kind of classes should they take as, say, undergrads, or even what can they think about even in high school?
In terms of paleotempestology? So geology, an undergraduate degree in geology would be the first thing, and then kind of a grad school for paleo. I think that there's lots of different techniques in paleo that you kind of need to be familiar with, how just radiometric dating the core is probably one of the trickiest things that we do. It's one thing to have all the storm layers, but then you need to know how old they are. So those sorts of things are really, really great. But I do find actually in the world of hurricane, there are a lot of people that have geoscience undergraduate degrees that then go on and go to school for meteorology for grad school, or go on to, there's a bunch of people that work at the National Hurricane Center. Hugh Willoughby has an undergraduate degree in geosciences. So I do think even if you are interested in hurricane but maybe don't want to be a paleotempestologist, geology is still a good undergrad degree to start off with. Yeah.
Joe, so where do you see the field going in the next, say, 10 to 15 years? I mean, what does paleotempestology look like in the future? What are advances that we may see coming out?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, there's not that many of us, but there are more than there were 10 years ago when I started. But Jeff Donnelly has actually started what's called Paleo HERDAT. So it's kind of the National Hurricane Center has HERDAT and HERDAT-2 as they're doing reanalysis for the instrumental storms. And so this is a Paleo HERDAT database, so you can go in and see where all the records are from. And so I do think we're kind of getting to a stage where there's enough of us and we're trying to use similar methodologies. I think trying to transition into something where we're using similar methods and we're creating these records that can be widely used, so that we can determine not only for a specific area what the return periods are like, but looking at the Atlantic as a whole or the Pacific Ocean as a whole. So I'm really grateful to be actually working with Jeff now. I think so. I would like to see more collaboration, less competition and more collaboration in science in general is always exciting for me. So.
Yeah, I love it, Joe. And it's interesting how all these different layers of professional work overlap and can feed off each other. I completely agree with you. I'd love to see more collaboration in the future myself. Joe, I think our listeners are going to love this episode. It ties into a lot of what we talk about on the podcast. How can people find you if they want to know who you are, they want to read about your research? How can people find you online?
So you can just Google my name, and I'm at Florida Gulf Coast University, so you'll see a couple of different websites come up with my papers, but then also the Whitaker Institute for STEM Education, which is where I sit now. You'll see us on there and all the projects we have going on and getting involved in research. Yeah, we have lots of different research projects, including the one that I'm working with you on. So I think if any students, even if they're not at FGCU, if they're interested, give us an email.
Well, thank you, Joe. You're doing fascinating work, and it's just going to be interesting to continue following the work that you and your team are doing as you move into the future. Joe, as we wrap up this episode of the GeoTrek podcast, what's one last take-home message you'd like to share with our listeners? Just one last thought for them to leave with.
I think in the context of science, just always being curious for any students out there, but I think people listening to this episode are obviously already curious people, but I also think in the context of hurricane, if you are living in a hurricane-prone coastline, I think the best thing is just being prepared. We say this every hurricane season, get your preparedness kit and all that. But what I do find when I talk to people in the community, I'm sure you've experienced this too, where you're chatting to people that have gone through an event, or it's coming up to hurricane season, and they don't really even know what code their house is built to, what their roof can withstand. So they ask me, when should I evacuate? I'm like, well, what can your roof withstand? And they don't really know the answer. So I think having that information ahead of time so that then you have all the info you need. Decision making is not always great when you've got a Cat 4 storm sitting offshore. I think it's good to know where your limits are and know what you would evacuate for ahead of time. That would be the advice I would give.
Joe, I agree 100%. If you know how well your house is built, if you know your elevation, if you know these things ahead of time and have a plan ahead of time, like you said, when that storm's sitting offshore, you already have a plan. You already have a checklist. You're not trying to figure these things out as a storm is knocking on your door. Joe, thank you so much. Really enjoyed this conversation. The work you're doing is so useful, and I know our listeners are going to love this episode.
Thanks, Hal.
Thank you so much, Joe, for joining us on the GeoTrek podcast. Amazing insights on how sediment cores building this area of paleotempestology can help us build a much longer record of what's happened as far as hurricanes and flood events, especially on the coast, as we discussed in this podcast episode. The major thing I took away from this is the need to really build a much longer record of coastal flood events. So often when I've traveled into coastal flood zones, I've talked to people who say, hey, I've dropped my flood insurance. I've lived here for 30 years. My house never flooded. Our neighborhood doesn't flood. When you go back farther in time into the record, though, you might see their house would have flooded multiple times if they had been there 100, 200 years ago. And with the help of Joe and her colleagues, we're able to extend that record back hundreds of years, in some cases, even more than 1,000 years. So seeing these sediment cores can really help reconstruct what's happened. And that has so much relevance in risk analysis for an area. If they had a massive flood, say 400 years ago, it could happen again today. So thanks again, Dr. Muller, for sharing these insights with us and sharing about this field of paleotempestology. Really seems like a mix of geology, coastal science, and weather, oceanography, kind of all overlapping. And I love, too, that you gave young professionals and students some insights on a path forward if they want to join in this exciting work. Thank you again for joining us on the podcast, and thank you to our listeners for consistently following the podcast, sharing this content with your friends and family. Your loyalty and engagement has consistently made the GeoTrek podcast a top-rated podcast on the field of natural disasters. Well, exciting stuff. We're going to continue following Dr. Joanne Muller and her team as we move into the future and as we move into this upcoming hurricane season. I'm your host, Hurricane Hal, and we'll catch you on the next episode of the GeoTrek podcast.